Good morning. My name is Kaylee Bradley. I am a licensed professional clinical mental health counselor, licensed in the state of Ohio. I also have supervision designation. I am an adjunct professor at Ashland University and their counseling department, as well as a doctoral student in counselor education and supervision at Ohio University. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about misconceptions of grief. We may all have different beliefs and thoughts about how grief, quote unquote, should operate. Hopefully today we'll dispel a few of those and discuss the unique and complex reality that grief seldom operates as we might think it should. One of the big things that I hope to relay in our brief time together today is that grief is varied, meaning it doesn't just associate with death loss. I like this video to get us started, kind of talking a little bit about what is grief. So let me pull that up for us. Okay. This is from a wonderful website called Refuge in Grief. I love this quote here. Grief is not an illness or a mental health problem. Grief is a natural part of life. So let's take a peek here. Let me share my sounds. Beautiful. Okay, here we go.
Grief is a set of experiences that involves the perceived loss that someone has around a person, a situation, a event, a happening that changes the way that they physically, emotionally, spiritually react and respond to the world around them. So if we're thinking about the way that we're taught that grief is, we're taught that it just involves a death event, a death of a loved one. But grief actually encompasses a series of losses and a series of change and has to do with how we integrate that change into our day-to-day functioning.
All right, so kind of a short little video, but I think it gets us started. So grief is more than death loss. Death loss, that's one of our big misconceptions that we're going to dispel. All right, let's keep going. So what comes to your mind when you think of the word grief? Kind of want you to reflect on that as we go along. Our goal in this brief webinar is myth busting, right? We're going to challenge some of these preconceived notions about what grief is, how it operates, etc. So I want you also to reflect, what are some things you thought were true about grief, but that maybe you have since realized may not be entirely accurate, or maybe in your own experience of grief, it's looked a little bit different than maybe you expected. The list of different myths that I'm going to discuss today is by no means exhaustive. There are many, but this first one that I want to really start with is this one. Grief progresses in stages and follows a linear path. This is a myth. I love this picture. So here's what we might expect out of grief, that we're going to go from all of these nice, neat, tidy stages, and then we're done, right? And I love this picture, which is a little more accurate in the reality of grief, right? I picture a child kind of scribbling, right? Okay. Grief only exists after a death loss. We've already begun to dispel this one a little bit, right? The reality, we grieve over a wide range of things in our lives, and those things should be validated, right? This is an interesting myth. Sadness, tearfulness is the only appropriate emotional response to grief. Here's some of the accurate and the many faces of grief, right? Numbness. I don't feel much of anything. Physical pain. Anger, frustration, irritability, tiredness, Grief is exhausting, okay? I think this video is worth watching. It asks this question: is it grief if I don't really cry? Let's take a peek.
If you have to do
All right, here it comes.
this, you need a new foundation.
Never bake again.
Once a month, patrons for the Grief Revolution get to hang out with me for an hour and ask me questions. So we're taking some of those questions and editing them for you here. So here's a question from a previous Patreon live Q&A session. What do you do if you don't express your grief through crying and maybe your partner or another family member does? Is it weird? Is it okay if you don't cry? Find out in this episode.
This idea that only tears are real grief. So Michael asks, if I have no tears to express my grief, am I not doing the work of grief? I'm peeking around to make sure that I understand his question and read it and share it back. And, you know, I think this is a question that men ask pretty often in male-identified people, but it's not just for men. Not everybody cries when they're sad. Not everybody yells when they're angry, right? There is no one expression, but just like a lot of the other cliches and stereotypes we have about grief, we have this image, right, of the sobbing, wailing widow or the sobbing, wailing mother. But that's not always true. Just because you aren't crying, just because your grief isn't running down your face, doesn't mean that you aren't in pain, right? Some people sleep when they're sad. Some people write or sing when they're sad. Some people's sadness leaks out on their face. Not everybody's does, right? That can get really tricky in relationships where one person is more expressive through tears and another person isn't, because then it can be like, wait a minute, don't you feel the same way that I do? And I think the conversation there is, you and I have very different expressions of our love. In Michael's case, you and I have very different expressions of our love for our son. It doesn't look the same. It didn't look the same when he was here, right? Your love for your child didn't look the same as your wife's love for your child. Your grief won't look the same either. And so to be able to have those conversations into that gap, into that dissonance that says we do this differently. One, where are the places we agree? Where are the places we meet? Where are the places we're similar? And where are the places we're different? And how can we honor those differences in each other? It's hard work. It's hard work for partners and for families to enter into those conversations about how we do things differently. It's very easy to jump into assumptions and to say, because you're not doing it the way that I do it, you don't feel the same way, and how dare you, right? So what's really, really important is to recognize that every expression of grief is valid, just as every expression of love is valid. And when there is difference, when there is dissonance, to speak to it, right? To name it, to say it out loud. And even as a question, even as a curiosity, to say, you know what I've noticed, that that I am not a crier, and I know that you express your grief in this situation by crying, and I wonder what is that like for you? What's that like for you to have me not cry and for you to cry? That's a wonderful question, right? It doesn't presume there's a problem, but it acknowledges that there's a difference. And how do we speak into that difference, right? These are really, really cool, grown-up, kick-ass relational communication skills. It's sort of ninja level to speak into that gap and that difference with curiosity and respect for each other. Yeah? All right. Bye.
All right. I love that video. It's a good reminder, right, that we all experience grief differently. And just because I may not cry doesn't mean I'm not grieving, right? And just because maybe you do cry doesn't mean you're grieving more. So interesting perspective that grief can manifest itself in a wide variety of emotions, right? This myth kind of builds on the prior one that came before, that grief only impacts us emotionally. I think every part of our personhood grieves. Our bodies, our cognitive abilities. Some folks will say to me, Kaylee, I keep forgetting things after a loss. Okay? Spirituality. I might have questions that I didn't have before. I may have doubts. Okay? So our spirituality can be impacted. So every piece and part of us. This is a big myth. Grief only lasts a year at most. Okay? Grief doesn't have a timeline. I often wish that it did. I often wish that I had a magic grief calendar that I could take a peek and I could say to a client that I'm working with as a counselor, you know what? You are going to be done with this grief thing on this date. But everybody's different. Okay. So give yourselves and your loved ones permission and self-compassion for the timeline and the pattern that your grief might operate in. This is another myth that I hear a lot, that you should return to work quickly and soon after a loss, as being busy helps with navigating grief. It depends, okay? What works for one person may not for another. Some folks have said to me that it's nice to have the support and the community of people that they work with after grief. Others say, you know what? Just the thought of that feels super overwhelming. And there's not a right or wrong answer to this, okay? I will encourage folks though that being busy is not going to take the grief away. I wish that we could kind of zoom over our pain, right? But we can't kind of go around it or under it. We do have to experience it. Now that looks different for everybody, right? Okay, but it does depend. So how I kind of want to end, and again, these are by no means an exhaustive list, but I want to end with a song to kind of help us take a deep breath and remind ourselves that how you and our loved ones experience grief is valid. And whether that looks like what you thought it would look like, whether it looks like how, somebody else, how they are processing their grief, okay? It may look different, and that's okay. So let me pull this up for us. Give me 1 second. I actually usually begin a lot of my webinars with this song, but I thought today we'll kind of end with it. Okay. All right.
To me and just be like, what the f is in your mug? And I would just tell them,
right. Well, hopefully that was a nice little moment in a busy day to catch your breath as you think about grief, whether that's as a helper, maybe you are someone in a mental health field navigating and working with grieving individuals, or maybe you're watching this because of your own personal experience with grief. I hope in this very, very brief webinar that you considered and thought about different myths about grief and misconceptions, that grief follows a timeline, that grief only lasts a year, that grief only means we're crying, and that there aren't other emotions or other parts of ourselves that are impacted. I hope those have been challenged. I would encourage you to maybe write yourself a permission slip with this phrase at the top: I give myself permission to grieve by, and then write out, maybe countering some of those myths. So you might say something like, I give myself permission to grieve by not believing that I have to be quote unquote done with my grief after a year. I give myself permission to grieve by allowing my body to rest as it navigates how grief impacts us physiologically. Those are just two examples. You can reach me at any time at Kailey, Kailey, at allrefuge.com, which is the name of my practice, Refuge Counseling, where I offer grief support and provide grief resources and grief consultations. Would love to hear from you if this brief webinar was helpful. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful and peaceful day.